I am Gqubule, a member of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan Project Management Unit, and facilitating the session in my personal capacity. I was told it is important to say that. I must say it's great to be home, to see familiar faces. I know how stressful the TIPS Forum is. Lesego, congratulations to the team. A round of applause to them. The final session. I'm sure you're very excited to go home and sleep. This final session intends to offer us an opportunity to collectively reflect on the inputs and insights provided over the course of a day and a half of the forum, with the aim to ultimately inform policy and practice. The contributions and insights presented over the course of the forum, I attended online yesterday, primarily explore the case of South Africa, its structure of production, key developments, continuities, discontinuities over the last 3 decades in the pursuit of structural transformation. The insights have also been situated, importantly, within the context or the evolving context of South Africa's political settlement and located in a global context. Collectively, the inputs have pointed to the need to understand the evolution and underpinnings of structural transformation in South Africa, with the aim to build a stronger coalition of interests that supports a coherent and coordinated structural transformation agenda that addresses structural challenges. So let me introduce our panelists for today of this final session, who will solve our problems. I'll start with my fellow alum, Mbongeni, who is Head of Trade and Industrialization at TWIMS. He's an academic, consultant, and development economist. He's the Ndlovu Academic Head of African Trade and Industrialization at TWIMS, an academic institution, and a senior researcher at BNM Analyst. Mbongeni's research and consulting focuses primarily on the automotive, clothing and footwear and agro-processing industries. Lovely to see you again. Dr. Ayanda Hlatshwayo is Director in the National Treasury of South Africa's Microeconomic Policy Unit in the Economic Policy Division. Her current position focuses on industrial policy, manufacturing and trade. She serves as part-time commissioner on the ITAC. That is the International Trade Administration Commission. Thando, or rather, Dr. Thando Vilakazi is Executive Director of CCRED at the University of Johannesburg, specializing in academic research, teaching and advice on competition policy and industrial development. He also serves as part-time member of the Competition Tribunal of South Africa. You can read Thando's very long bio, but his research, and he has led research and provided teaching and advisory services across various economic sectors for competition authorities, regulators, government departments, etc. Boitumelo Molete is a Social Development Policy Coordinator at COSATU. She is the lead on climate change and just transition for the Trade Union Federation. The key focus of her work is social policy, including policies on transport, housing, health, and comprehensive social security, as well as climate change. Her responsibilities include engaging with stakeholders on various topical issues that are impacting climate change and the just transition in various sectors and industries. So in terms of the format for this final session, we don't have much time. We've been given an extra 8 minutes, but I will start by posing a set of questions, one each, and then open to the floor, and hopefully the online, if you can check for me, a couple of questions from online participants as well. To begin, as I've mentioned, this is an opportunity to collectively reflect. Thando, I'll start with you, and reflecting over the day and a half. In the first day, it was alluded that inclusive industrialization depends on achieving structural change, and dismantling barriers to entry becomes an important pillar to allow a new system of accumulation to emerge. Reflecting on your work and drawing from the lessons over the 20-year of implementation of BBBE, what are the key points of intervention that you feel we need to confront?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will try to be brief. There's a short answer, which is that we've got to do the basics as we've always been saying we need to do. But I think a more dynamic answer is to think through what these kind of global structural shifts and shocks actually teach us, right, and remind us of. I think they're very good, as we saw with COVID, at stress testing economies and stress testing production systems, re-raising questions about the distribution of rents and returns through value chains, and telling us again, I think, about and the kind of some of the horror stories around who gets to capture returns and who doesn't, right? In the context of inclusion in the South Africa context, but arguably throughout at least Southern and East Africa region that I've worked on, the picture is not terribly rosy in terms of building dynamic economies where you've got a plurality of producers over time, where you've got significant industrial upgrading, and a greater diversity of participants in value chains, right? I think the presentations, even just today, highlight all of that. They're still saying, well before COVID, well before the global financial crisis, that we need to do more to build kind of domestic production bases in South Africa, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, etc., in the region, right? And so I think the boring answer, as I say, is that the picture looks relatively the same. That being said, I think just to reflect a bit on something like BEE, and I think it has implications in other areas as well. One of the things that BEE has done, as much as it gets quite a bit of grief, is that it put the issue of inclusion and equity into the boardroom. Right? So it put it on the conversation to say whether we all like it or not, and whether we agree or not, this will be part of South African corporate and policy discourse, right? And I think this was absolutely important to do. I think leaving it too open would not have brought the issues that we're still grappling with today onto the table, right? Now the stats and the record doesn't kind of speak too well for how far we've come, but arguably, at least in certain respects, we've done quite a bit in what is actually otherwise a policy area that kicks off 2003 with the first kind of official DTIC strategy, right? Reflecting on all of that, and I think there's plenty of literature around this, I think one comes back to a couple of kind of cross-cutting issues. So I think as we sit now at 20 years later from that DTIC strategy for BEE, I don't think we've done enough in the areas that actually make a difference, right? So the areas where you're now talking about building challenger firms and building capable firms that can upgrade over time and start to challenge and change market outcomes. This is moving from inclusion as nameplate and percentages to meaningful economic participation. I think there's pockets where we might be able to draw lessons, your Black Industrialist program, et cetera. But systemically, we haven't dealt with the kind of obvious issues, right? So you can fund and fund and fund, and I kind of seem to always want to say this. We can fund and fund and fund and do all the tax incentives and whatnot to build production capabilities, right? But if those goods cannot get on the shelf, those goods cannot reach market or feed into a further downstream manufacturing process or customer base, then all that funding and all that investment is essentially wasted, right? And so I think greater attention to a kind of what we call a barrier to entry 2.0 agenda is probably how we build from what we've learned and start to move forward. And I think with that actually comes the kind of economic resilience and dynamism that makes us more resistant over time to global structural shifts and shocks as well. And I'll be happy to say a bit more about that a bit later.
All right. And directly moving on from that framing, Mbongeni, I then come to you, given your experience, particularly your research on the auto sector, which has, as we heard in the first day, been highly incentivized under successive industrial policy and stands out in terms of value of exports with limited, we could argue about it, benefits from UTNEG to society, particularly that region. So reflecting on the current state of South Africa's automotive industry, amidst the ongoing global structural changes, are there any specific challenges and opportunities that stand out in this new era of GVC transformation, which I hope you'll also talk to the impact of CBAM potentially?
Okay, I'll see what I can do. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Baba and Thando for those remarks. I like what Thando was saying, which is the lens of looking at these global disruptions as stress testers of economies and stress testers of our policies. And I think it's exactly within that frame that I can talk to the automotive industry, because the automotive industry is a pocket of excellence within Southern Africa's industrial policy. What the policy does is it focuses on what I call the economics of the industry. So the economics of the industry are economies of scale. So you need long production runs, at least 80 to 100,000 units of production to be economically viable. It needs technology. So we work with global OEMs who develop the industry, and it needs a market. And the market that we focused on was the EU. So 65% of the vehicles that we make go to the EU, and that's part of the EU trade deal. So there's an industrial policy incentive for production, and there's a trade policy mechanism that links to the EU. So now we have these disruptions, right? And these disruptions threaten to undermine these economics, and so they threaten to mind the economics from a demand side, because EU, for example, changing patterns of demand. We're seeing the very question of vehicle ownership being questioned in those markets versus where we are in South Africa and Africa. It's threatening us from a demand perspective because these global disruptions make us less competitive. Our supply chain less competitive, and it threatens us from a regulation perspective because of the EU Green Deal and potentially CBAM, which will make us disruptive. So what are some of the policy options on the table? Well, the first thing is, I think, and going back to this question of stress testing, what we do, I think what we do is still relevant. So the economies of scale, at least in the short to medium term, are not going to change. The question may be, if we evaluate these three things. So the first thing that we evaluate is this idea of economies of scale. So does a production run of 100,000 units still make sense within the market? And that there may be some shifts that we need to make there, right? So we could incentivize smaller production runs, for example, in certain sectors, which actually stimulates manufacturing. The other point that I made is technology. So the question is, who holds the technology? Who holds the IP? So if we're saying, for example, we're going to move from ICE, internal combustion engine, to battery electric vehicles, are those the same OEMs that are currently being represented? Do we need to bring in a new set of IP to work with in the industry? And then lastly, it's the market. And this is one of the exciting things, because actually what this has stimulated us to do is to say, let's look at the African markets as an opportunity. So the industry has developed an association, the AAAM, who are investigating the prospects of developing the African market. There are a lot of challenges, some of which have been reflected on. And my view is, I think somebody was saying, was asking the question, what is the fundamental reason for the lack of trade? Well, actually, there's a very logical economic reason, which is lots of small markets, poor trade infrastructure. what's called the gravity model of trade. Explains completely what we have. So even if you change the policies, you're not going to necessarily change that, which means that you actually have to develop a process that says, let's go and harmonize the standards. Let's build the markets in different economies. Let's investigate the opportunities for shifting in the value chain. So shifting, for example, from being assembly and components and looking at the raw material opportunities. I think one of the speakers alluded to those as an opportunity, because we do have the endowments of minerals, and that could potentially keep us there. So I'll leave it there, and we can interrogate that a bit further in the discussion later. Thanks, Bob.
Sure. Perhaps it was a big question, but perhaps Boitumelo can talk to the second half of that question. And I mean, what we've heard a lot is that the evolution of structural transformation, using the South African case, that is, has depended on the country's political settlement. And reflecting on your area of work, what are some of the key lessons regarding key points of intervention that we need to pursue in order to build coalitions that support industrial policy in ways that fundamentally change the existing economic power structure? And I would pose that to you. And then just a sub as we pursue a just transition.
Sure. Thank you very much, Baba. I think taking from how my co-panelists here have spoken about how the manufacturing industry is quite intense in South Africa, and I think the most sensible way, I'd say, would be to really invest in the sector, right? And acknowledge the fact that the sector is a sector that is quite intensive in the labor part of things. I will speak from a labor perspective in that we need to invest in the sector when it comes to the reskilling and upskilling of workers in the sector to ensure that they are part of this transitioning sector. A lot of the times we focus on the future of work as opposed to focusing on the current workforce. And we leave behind the fact that within a transition are actual people that need to be protected and need to be taken through the transition. So I think when we speak about that, we need to focus really solely on ensuring that there are the correct safety nets to ensure that workers in the sector are able to transition and workers are able to work in an economically viable sector. I think also we can start from the fact that industrial policy in itself needs to be reconstructed. There needs to be industrial policy reform that will ensure that there is a structured manner in which we transition. When we speak about a just transition, we're not only speaking about to a low carbon economy, we're speaking about workers actually going through and wanting to participate in an economy that is not fit for them. So we need to also establish pathways for workers so that they are able to participate in the economy and be able to form parts of an economy that's functioning, as opposed to us having policies that are stagnant or policies that are oppressive to workers. It's going to be important that we focus on that. And also, I think when we speak about the future of work, we need to ensure that there is sufficient investment in education and training. Also, I think when it comes to policy reform, when we speak to the curriculum changes, right? It's quite important that we focus on that element because the new low carbon economy does not cater for the current curriculum. And if you don't start there, we're going to have quite a number of problems when it comes to the transition. My co-panelist speaks about technology. It's going to be important that we invest in technology and the research of technology and what viable technology is going to be used for us in the transition and what technology can we best use. When we speak about the coal mining sector and we speak to decommissioning, the pace in which it happens is usually very fast-paced and leaves workers out. So I think it's helpful that in the entire processes, we consider that workers are not passengers on the flight. They need to be at the forefront of the discussions to ensure that policies are informed by actual experiences on the ground, as opposed to experiences just on a policy level only. I always make reference to the COSATU Just Transition Blueprint for Workers, which speaks about pathways for workers in the various sectors that workers are in. And these are not informed by, yes, there is some reflection by experts, but workers themselves have an answer with regards to how they believe the transition should take place and how the future of their work will look like. So policies essentially need to cover that element. And as a social policy coordinator, it's my job to ensure that the voice of the workers' communities are echoed in policy making and in policies that are being implemented and adopted. Thank you.
Thank you. Wait, Ayanda. Always comes back to Treasury, right? Many of the inputs, not just from Boitumelo, call for the need for a new vision for reindustrialization, underpinned by a political settlement that prioritizes long-term investment in productive capacity. Could you perhaps provide and reflect on National Treasury's role in supporting a long-term perspective on building local capabilities?
So I think embedded in that question is a discussion around trade-offs, right? Between your short-term and long-term, your short-term costs and your long-term gains. And, you know, I think it's a good and difficult question to answer, not just for South Africa, but I think internationally, because most countries have to make decisions between intertemporal choices. And so I think you then want, you know, to make sure that you, at the core of it, you become a country that uses more evidence-based processes in getting to quantifying which policy proposals make sense and the unintended consequences that sometimes come with those choices. So I do think that when we speak about localization at times, or supporting local production, we sometimes look very inward as South Africa. I think it's come out in some of the presentations as well, where some of our master plans, for example, focus solely on South Africa's industry. Unfortunately, with all the changes that we've seen over the past year or two, with the global structural changes, you see that it's actually important to consider the region, to consider how you actually build supply chain resilience. And you can't just only, you need to diversify and also build regional capabilities. So for South Africa, for us to actually grow, we do need to have a more regional aspect and focus on things. That's one of the ways in which we're going to be able to attract more investment going forward. I mean, you've heard Mbongeni talking about, them looking at Africa as more of a market and developing that. And I think the AfCFTA, for example, being finalized and implemented is a beginning step, or it's a first step to us moving in that direction. I think that's one of the things that I just want to raise, because I think sometimes it can seem as though some of our policies would sometimes hinder us moving forward into the region. Some of the decisions we sometimes make on a tariff basis, for example, it seems as though within SADC, we aren't at a point where we sometimes speak as one voice, and we sometimes have South Africa against some of the other countries and wanting to hold on to certain markets instead of allowing and letting go of certain things and having discussions around, if we're going to make a regional strategy work, if we're going to be able to plug into regional value chains, how do we support our domestic market while also ensuring that we can plug into regional value chains in ways that are mutually beneficial for ourselves and our neighboring countries. I think the East African community, for example, has been a lot better at doing that. I think SADC could get better as well, so that we are able to actually leverage the opportunities that are presented by stuff like the AfCFTA or policies like the AfCFTA. Thanks.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just, while you still got the mic, I mean, inherent in your contribution, your input, is the need to discuss how we settle disputes between departments as we are deciding on co-creating, negotiating those costs, risks, benefits. And I'd wonder if you could perhaps provide a perspective on that as we negotiate industrial policy.
Okay, so how I would say, I think there's always scope for more collaboration, and coming together of different government departments as well as agencies. I think the Treasury currently does play quite we input into quite a few processes, but I think at the core of our industrial policy challenges, I think we need to elevate the intersection between industrial policy, trade policy, as well as competition policy, and how we then allow these three tools to sort of reinforce each other with a longer term lens of having more green, not green, but have a more regional, strategy that you work towards, and underlying in that, I suppose, because now I've mentioned green, but a more green strategy where you're able to take, where you're able to leverage those opportunities. But fundamentally, it's getting to a point where sometimes I think sometimes we tend to use certain policy instruments and weigh heavily on them, which sometimes polarizes arguments. So if, let's say, you have a reliance on tariffs, for example, that might support primary producers versus the downstream producers. And already, you're starting from a point where it seems as though you're favoring one part of the value chain and not another. And I think you can sort of elevate those and talk more about how we fundamentally change the structural composition of some of the sectors from a competition lens, and also make sure that our trade policy reinforces our industrial policy objectives as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the floor, and if those online could raise their hands or put their questions in the box, and then we'll attend to them after we've attended to questions in the room. Any questions or reflections or inputs? There's one gentleman to the far right of me.
Thanks. This is quite a sobering part of the session as we try and take it forward. My question is for Mbongeni. It's only in the last 2-3 years that we started seeing, I think there was a DTIC policy around this shift from ICE, I think transport as well. And one could argue that we were quite late in the shift, because part of the argument is that you bring these internationals in, you leverage part of the know-how, and internally we must have our own strategy to shift and upgrade and start making the movement. So what really delayed that changeover? What were the barriers? And on top of that, what can we take, for instance, when we look at the renewable energy value chain, where we know already that even throughout the 5 bid windows, largely the technologies around wind, around solar, are largely coming from outside. And I think our compatriots from the Northern Cape, they will tell you, and I think even last year they've showed that the localization effort in the Northern Cape has actually not taken off in any sort. So how can we transfer some of those challenges that you experience in the automotive, perhaps the renewable energy space? Otherwise, we're going to be finding ourselves in the same fashion 10 years later. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another one at the back.
Hi, I'm Safiabu from UCT for the purposes of this conversation. My question is for Mbongeni as well. And it's really about, you spoke about motor vehicle industry and, the policy elements. What I want to have a reasonable understanding on is basically the policy that the draft for the battery electric vehicles is out, but there's been no movement for the last year, maybe 18 months. What exactly is the barriers and the hold up in that space? Because as a country, we're running out of time. If the EU is our primary partner that we deal with in terms of exports, their policies that are coming out, say by 2035, they will not be accepting any more ICE vehicles. So what is the perspective on why is this taking so long, so that we start incentivizing the OEMs to actually shift to start manufacturing these? Thank you.
I'll take one more and then sure.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman Mateko. My question is related to what the previous speaker said, and it's directed to Mbongeni. I want to check that given the close deadline, which is of 2030 for banning of non-electric vehicles, is the South African automobile sector ready to deal with the transition? And what are we going to do? Because the transition can bring other new employment, but also possible job losses, because not everyone who is in the current sector may be able to fit within the development or the production of electric vehicles. So what are we looking at in terms of the future? And is the deadline achievable of 2030, given that only a few of the stakeholders within the car manufacturing sector are active in the production of EVs? Thank you.
All right, Mbongeni. You're up.
No problem. I wanted to reflect on some other things, but that the colleague said, but I think we have to deal with this issue. So let's start with the question of the policy, because it's a concerning one, and it's concerning for me too. So part of it had to do with the fact that the global multinationals themselves don't necessarily have the same positions, right? So we have a combination of European OEMs and Japanese, Asian OEMs in South Africa. The two don't necessarily have the same strategies operating. So the German OEMs are basically going to follow the EU position, whereas the Japanese OEMs, you see a bit more plurality in their strategy. Take Toyota, Isuzu, Nissan versus VW and Mercedes-Benz, for example. So that was part of it. What we did do from a consulting perspective and input into government is we looked at what was required to make this transition work. We identified that you need both a demand side stimulus and a supply side stimulus. Why do we need a demand side stimulus? Well, at the moment, hybrid electric vehicles, 12% premium over ICE. Plug-in hybrid vehicles are around 40% premium over ICE. Battery electric vehicles, 52% premium. There's no way in which the South African market will be able to large scale absorb NEVs based on this premium. So one of the issues we had to deal with the demand side, the other issue is the supply side. So we put down some recommendations there. The challenge at the moment is, I think the minister is trying to grapple over how to deal with that. The mention that he's made publicly last year was that they're not committed to do demand side. They're going to try and focus on the supply side, but obviously that has implications. So what will that mean? Well, when we meet with the OEMs now, they're saying by 2033, 2037, there needs to be battery electric vehicles in the mix. It means that you might end up having a separation between local supply and export supply, for example. And it might also mean that there are going to be some tough transitions in terms of which OEMs would take the sense and which OEMs don't, based on this. I don't want it to be too specific after that. What are we exploring in terms of the value chains? Well, the obvious ones, right? Batteries. We're exploring the opportunity there, and it's both from a mineral beneficiation perspective. So one of the OEMs has said, for example, we are willing to export battery grade materials and be the lead source supplier to Germany. So that's an opportunity. Another opportunity is assembling the batteries. The cells is a bit more complicated, but what you want to do is to match battery storage and electric vehicles. And then lastly, wind and solar opportunities. We need to look at what I call the transversal opportunities, things like aluminium, things like plastics, things like PC boards. What are the kind of transversal opportunities that speak both to renewable energy and automotives and other light and heavy industry? I hope that helps.
All right, I will take one more round. There's nothing online. All right, I'll take one more round.
I was debating whether to ask Mbongeni another question, but shame, the poor guy. Mbongeni, nice to see you again. So I couldn't help but wonder, after you just explained now about some of the issues and the climate policy issues, etc. You at the beginning you were talking about the importance of scale economies for autos, and you mentioned potentially a portion of production perhaps servicing the export market versus a portion of production, if I understood correctly, a portion of production serving the domestic market, given some of the constraints that you've highlighted, the premiums, etc. On the back of the importance of scale economies, is such a strategy, in your opinion, viable? And I understand there's a diversity in the approaches from the different OEMs. So maybe just a general sense. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll take the gentleman.
Thanks very much. Yash Ramkaran from DN Economics. Mbongeni, another question. No, I joke. This is a question for you, Thando, and I don't expect a full answer. On transformation, we know there's an absolute imperative around transformation. It goes without saying. And I think, as you've mentioned, the history around BEE specifically is mixed in terms of success. More recently, I think we've seen a stronger focus on a stick approach in terms of enforcing BEE and employment equity more generally. But I'm interested in design. If you think about design and transformation, and specifically from your perspective, I think you would know better than me that the range of oligopolies and market concentration across South African economy. How does design and the changes in design around employment equity and EPE influence outcomes? And what sort of design changes would you make? Thanks.
So we give Mbongeni a break, and Thando, you can take that question. And then Mbongeni to follow with answering Mohammed's question.
Sure. Thanks, Yash. I think there's a few things here, right? So I think your question actually hits at a big part of what we should be talking about as it relates to BEE right now. Right? So if you read the preamble of the thing, it's actually got a very large remit, right? It also speaks about the interlinked areas of skills development and a range of other labor market policies, etc., that were all collectively meant to bring us to a more participatory economy, right? I think what happened somewhere along the way is that it became the proxy for achieving economic transformation in South Africa. And I think that might be where we got it wrong, right? So any failures to do with inclusion, etc., ultimately in the discourse get pinned back to there, right? And I actually don't think that that's necessarily fair. So from a design perspective, right, maybe 3 points to make. One is that I don't think we're putting enough pressure on the other related and kind of corresponding measures that are meant to be addressed so as to have an economy where economic transformation is achieved, right? So it does matter what we do in skills. It absolutely matters what we do in the labor market, etc., right? But yet the emphasis is not there in terms of the discourse, right? It ultimately comes down to who owns the JSE, and all sorts of economists then have debates about the percentage, right? In any event, by the highest estimate on any of those percentages and any of those reports, it's simply not enough, right? So I think that there's more at a broader level that we should be thinking about. More specifically, we've written a bit about trying to draw lessons from things like the Black industrialists kind of policy experiment, really, right? Because it was a bold call to focus and ring fence a program targeted specifically at Black-owned, HDP-owned manufacturing firms. And I think there's some very interesting insights from there. Although we don't incentivize it other than at the application stage, what we found, at least in engaging with the firms that have been beneficiaries, is that it is these types of smaller, not JSE listed challenger firms that are doing the big investments in new production technologies, in greener production systems, and it's enabling them to then take on the kind of traditional oligopolistic or kind of highly concentrated players in the market. And I think this is really important, right? And so we've taken a chance in that we focus a policy program on how do you get the type of firm. So this thing is not going to solve all the problems, but how do you get the type of firm in manufacturing widgets off a South African production base into value chains, right? And I think this was an important shift because we changed because we started to focus more on the economics of the thing, as Mbongeni was saying. It seems to us, at least in that analysis, is that we started to ask the question of what are the things that need to be in place for you to be able to build an effective, medium-sized, Black-owned, woman-owned rival that then starts to take on your traditional players. And I think this is an important shift, right? And more needs to be understood about all of that. Maybe just two more points. I think what we measure within BEE is, and particularly obviously the implementation tool, which is the scorecards, is flawed. And I think it's time to have another look, right? I think it's problematic to use a percentage of NPAT measure. I think it is, I forget the precise wording, effectively turnover, right, or returns, to say how much do you spend on locally procured products, or even through your value chain, sourcing goods from what I think is a range of increasingly more competitive domestic producers of these goods, right? What happens then is that you end up with the kind of procurement from a ton of cleaning firms and security, which is important in and of itself, right? Particularly from a labor perspective, right? But we haven't dealt with the rules around what can you do to bring your medium-sized intermediate manufacturer of widget X plastic bottles, right, into the production process of a large incumbent player in the industry, right? There are examples of where that type of integration of firms into the VCs has actually done more than a small kind of CSI investment or whatever it might be. In fact, it allowed the firms to become players in the markets, right? So I think what we measure matters. And I think looking at the measures again might be a useful starting point. With a view to saying BE is no longer going to be focused on just a broad brush kind of intervention, but actually, how do we get market access right? We know that there are some of these Black industrial firms. We know that there's a greater diversity. Not all of them will make it, of course, but how do you get them market access, right? And I think there's some horror stories out there, but also some really good ones, which I'd be happy to talk more about. And we've got papers about this on the website as well.
Thanks. I really like, if you indulge me, to comment on some of the discussion we've had. I think we've been talking about your policy matching your let's call it the economics. I like the point that was being made about looking at the relationship between trade policy, industrial policy, and even other policies, sets of policies. And I think what I'd like to add to that, which I think we're hinting at now, is that the value chain approach still matters. So trying to understand where value is created, and the trade-offs between focusing on one aspect of the value chain first versus focusing on another aspect of the value chain matters. So to answer the question that Mohammed asked, which is what happens when we have lower production runs for local or domestic production. What that implies is that we lose value addition because the economies of scale doesn't make sense. But can we gain value addition in other segments of the value chain, such as the battery minerals beneficiation? And that's what we need to deal with. And that's what we need to model as economists and provide insights for the right kind of policy environments as well as an incentive if required to develop the structural transformation that we need.
Thank you. I'll take one last question and then thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. My question goes to Boitumelo. You mentioned something very important about, getting workers upskilled, especially in terms of, I think we've established that we're talking a lot about the automotive industry and this shift by the EU. What have unions managed to, what kind of commitments have unions managed to get in terms of this upskilling of workers, making sure that workers, not as many workers get left behind in this shift that is inevitably going to happen?
Sure. Thank you very much for that. I think the unions have been very vocal in speaking about what this means for them, what the just transition in its entirety means for them and across sectors, right? What we have done at this stage is we've first prepared our membership. We first started at the base of the research, and we are articulating what it means from a very scientific perspective, and then going down to the workers and asking them to speak to us with regards to their experiences. So what we've actively been doing is engaging with workers, but also linking workers to the discussions that are happening at policy level, and also encouraging them to speak to their employers, to have employers craft pathways that are workplace driven, that are plant driven, so that workers are able to be incorporated into the planning of whatever the employers envisaging the future to look like. So what we're doing is having these skills gap identified from the trade union perspective, but also encouraging for workers to speak to their employers, workers to incorporate in their collective bargaining negotiations, conditions that will ensure that there's a safety net when it comes to their protection and the just transition and the future of their work. So that's the role in which the trade union is playing, to facilitate the discussion, but also prepare the workforce for a future. And we are quite sober in that the just transition in its nature will bring disruptions. So the level of job losses should not be what we're focusing on. We're focusing on creating jobs, hopefully in the future, that these workers will be reskilled into and not left behind. So that's the kind of structure that we've taken as a federation, as COSATU firstly, but also as organized labor sitting at NEDLAC. Thank you.
All right. Time is not on our side. I'm going to give each of you, should you choose, a chance to do concluding remarks. Mbongeni, please keep it short. I'm going to start with Boitumelo, since she's got the mic, and then we'll wrap it up for lunch.
Sure, Baba. I think for me, I would just want to emphasize the importance of collaboration when it comes to this. Labor on its own cannot have the answers, but business has answers, and so does government. So we need to collaborate in a meaningful manner. There needs to be meaningful engagement and social dialogue to be able to get to a consensus. But I also think it's going to be important that we incorporate issues such as localization and empowering SMMEs to participate, because that's where most jobs will be actually created. But also, this is a controversial one, but we speak about the importance, especially in the coal mining and energy discussion, of the importance of empowering state-owned entities to be able to participate meaningfully in these transitions and in the new low carbon economy. The importance of economic diversification is going to be important, as well as ensuring that there are jobs that are created in this new economy, because that's how they pitch it, right? These jobs are decent work. They are with the standard of labor laws, and that workers are not being given jobs that will not be beneficial or helpful to their futures, with a lot of social protection that should take place. Because a lot of the times we tend to forget that with the disruption comes a lot of loss, and we need to ensure that workers are protected sufficiently. I think that would be mine on when it comes to the workers' perspective. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to be short. So the one thing is I needed just to defend the master plans, right? The master plans, Boitumelo is talking about the coalition of government, civil society, unions, and the private sector. This is what the idea of the master plans was supposed to be. So if there's a breakdown there, or if these kinds of discussions are not being talked about, I think it's incumbent upon us to raise these matters there. But it was not just about the agreed outcomes, but it was also about the institutional process of dealing with issues. And so this is what's important. The other thing, because I really wanted to be controversial, but I didn't get a lot of time. So the other thing I wanted to be controversial about, so we've spoken about Africa. There is another global dispensation, BRICS, that also exists. But I think we need to be circumspect. We've shown throughout all of our presentations here to what degree, for example, China competes with us and has created a surge in imports from these countries. And we don't even have a trade agreement with them. These things are coming in at let's call it the general duty. So to think carefully about these kinds of shifts and who we align ourselves with globally. You know, in my mind, there isn't one who's necessary, because the Europeans are trying to get us with the EU, but the Chinese could also get us with trade. So that's all.
I think for me, in closing, it's just to highlight, I think we've spoken a lot about some of the challenges that, this current season has brought, and some of the lessons that we've had from, disruptions in value chains. And it's just really looking at the opportunities that this presents for us. I think in South Africa, with our limited fiscal space, it's important sometimes for us not to view sound fiscal policy as a dichotomy between sound fiscal policy and industrial policy, but rather to see sound fiscal policy as a foundation where you need a competitive environment, you need low interest rates, you need high ease and low cost of doing business, you need, a confidence-inducing environment for firms to thrive. And so it's important for us to continue to work towards those. I think some of the key economic reforms that we've been implementing and trying to fast track and push forward through Operation Vulindlela are testament to that in the electricity and the transport sectors. And I think it's important to increasingly have a discussion around what it's going to take for us to make a regional strategy work in South Africa, and what it's going to take for us to focus on green industries and how we make that the foundation for our future growth. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I'll be quite brief. I mean, I got kind of boxed into the inclusion issues, but that's fine too.
Because you're black.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's tough.
That's precisely the problem. So just briefly, I mean, I think to echo some of the sentiment, the region is going to become and is in fact absolutely critical, right? And I think a policy stance by South Africa that still sees the region as the place where we send some of our goods and buy nothing back. This is not sustainable, right? If you think about even just some of what Molete and the team were presenting earlier about what it's going to take to respond to some of the kind of variable weather patterns where you're going to have a lot of rain in Tanzania and the eastern and Mbeya region, etc., whilst you have a drought further south, right? It means those will become the places where we are going to get food, right? When you're linking it back to food security issues, and supply of products into even the South African market, the region becomes absolutely indispensable. As they say, these are some of the most currently arable and probably resilient areas in terms of climate going forward as well, right, relative to our own position further south. So the region is critical. What we're showing in the work that we're doing now through the African Market Observatory is that the problem there is that the regional markets do not work. So you've still got trader level collusion going on. You've still got, so you may open up the borders with the AfCFTA, but if a bunch of 4 traders or wholesalers decide that those goods will not move between these two countries, you are not going to have inter-regional change. So it's to remind us again that I think the conference has been really powerful in this regard. So bringing back, as has been happening here, the kind of sector level focus and industry level focus, right? Because until you tap into some of that, we maybe miss some of the barriers that are actually inhibiting what is potentially a more dynamic regional market, right? So we've got to do the ugly work. We've got to get the borders working. We've got to get competition law agencies, the DTIC, the competition aspect of it, right? Where we've now got the mandate to engage in some of these issues, to say, how do we use those tools to actually open up these markets, right? CBAM, EU, et cetera, is going to have implications for where we send our goods. But the regional markets may well remain open and remain as opportunities, but you're going to have to deal with some of the perhaps micro level things that need to happen as well to make those markets work. And I think the time is probably now.
Thank you. Can we give our panelists a lovely round of applause? Boitumelo, Mbongeni, Ayanda, Thando, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your patience. I know we were between lunchtime, but thank you very much. Travel safely. And I think we've got Lesego who will introduce our final speaker. Thank you.
Thank you to Baba and our panel members for their insights. We have reached the end of our 2-day program. And before I hand over to our last speaker, who's going to give us a closing, the team and I would like to thank all the moderators, all the speakers, our attendees as well, in person and online, as well as Baba and the panel members for making this forum exciting, but also a successful one. So thank you so much. And the papers and presentations and recordings will be available in a week's time on the TIPS Forum website. I'd also kindly like to request our panel members and Baba to please wait outside by the TIPS banner for a photo. Thank you for that. And so the closing address is by Dr. Tebogo Makube. Dr. Tebogo Makube is Chief Director, Industrial Procurement at the DTIC. Before joining the DTIC, Dr. Makube was the Program Manager, Fiscal Policy at the Financial and Fiscal Commission. Prior to that, he was Director at Provincial Infrastructure at the National Treasury. He also has research and management positions at the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, National Energy Regulator of South Africa, and Nokusa Consulting. He is also a board member of Proudly South African. Dr. Makube holds a PhD in energy studies and other qualifications in law, economic policy, and energy economics. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Fellow board members of TIPS, I don't see any members soon. Program directors, Mr. Sol Levin and Professor Fiona Tragano, distinguished panelists and participants, ladies and gentlemen, again, good afternoon. Can I see who's a career politician here? So that's a challenge in Africa, right? So policy is discussed, or papers are discussed by academics and practitioners, and people who decide on the policy choices are not here. So I think that is the biggest challenge we are having. I think in future, it is important that we have them, not to come and present political speeches, but to participate, in such forums. I'm impressed by the quality of discussions at this forum. I think the presentations provide us with food for thought, all right, as to what needs to be done. But again, looking back at the theme for this forum, it's industrial policy in the era of global structural change, implications for Southern Africa. Do we have the answers for that? Or did we do justice in discussing this theme? All right, because that is, it's a challenge for developing countries to drive structural transformation. And in my view, we don't have the space, time, and sovereignty to determine our policy choices, especially at this current juncture. So I think it's Niva Makhetla and Sol, in one of their papers, they've argued that, we are a resource-based economy, and mostly African countries. And I've raised the issue yesterday that we are still trapped in that paradigm. And Niva has argued that, for instance, in South Africa, in the past 8 years, the mining chain has contributed to 60% of SA exports, and at 10% of that coming from agriculture. So 70% of exports is mining and agriculture. And as you know, mining or commodities broadly are prone to global price swings. And they've not really driven shared growth for many people, So the argument is that, the mining sector is exclusionary because we export unprocessed products. So we have spoken about beneficiation of minerals for years, and nothing has been done, and we continue to invest in dedicated logistics aimed at exporting unprocessed minerals. So even the restructuring of Transnet, is aimed at still processing or exporting those minerals. So another argument linked to that is that, as a country, recently we have been relying more also on the exportation of steel related products, all right, being manganese, iron ore, again unprocessed. So which is a problem in South Africa. And then when we speak about manufacturing, if we don't process those products, it becomes a problem for us. So our immediate neighbors, your Lesotho, Botswana, Swaziland, they rely on SACU revenues, right? So then the issue is if we speak about transformation, structural transformation, what does it mean for those countries? All right. Which again, as I've raised, is, are we doing justice to the theme of the forum this year? So without really wasting time, I think for me, moving forward, the issue is how do we target the investments in areas that will also enhance productivity growth, both capital and labor. How do we change the composition of exports? The AfCFTA has been touted as another big thing, but I'm not really hopeful, given that nothing is being processed in other African countries. We are exporting those minerals, so it's that going to be the next big thing for Africa. So scholars must still do work on that. Green technologies, energy. In South Africa, energy is a critical thing now. Energy is the center of civilization. Energy is the source of growth. And we know that over the years, there's been some energy transitions, from wood to coal, and coal being the drive of steam engines. And now it's about green technologies, And my argument is that, pricing has been the biggest instrument in changing behavior, in embracing different technologies. But South Africa has also used load shedding to, drive investments in green technologies. But globally, and it's immediate. We know that the carbon taxes in Europe, the border taxes, are coming into effect in 2026. That's going to be immediate issue affecting us. In Mozambique, I think is it Mozambique, which it's the biggest employer in Mozambique, in the aluminium sector. It's faced with an immediate issue of whether the aluminium being manufactured by Mozal, is it green? And its argument is that because it's using hydro electric as an input source from Kabora, Basa, that aluminum is green, but that is being questioned, right? So we are going to see tariff and non-tariff barriers, especially in the energy sector being used. Immediate sectors that will be affected will be steel industry, your cement, iron ore, fertilizers, all right? And what does it mean for Africa? It's a question, all right? So will it perpetuate, the trajectory that we have been exporting those minerals to be processed in European countries? Because from a tax point of view, that makes sense to do that. Because if your energy source is not green, then there will be more taxes. So those are the issues that us as scholars must resolve. And forum like this and collaborations with universities are important, in informing and driving policy. So thank you very much, Sol, for organizing it and inviting me to close this forum. It's much appreciated. And enjoy your lunch and continue to network. Thank you.